First of all, welcome. My name is Ryan Perry. I'm the Digital Collections Librarian here at the Central New York Library Resources Council. This webinar is intended to go over all the aspects of our Access and Digitization grants. And so hopefully this will be of use for everybody who's attending in person, and I'll also make it available as a recording after the fact. So if you need to go back and reference something, or if you are watching this after the fact, welcome as well. So I'll make it available on our grant website, and I'll also email it out to all the people who registered for this webinar and our whole list. So you'll see it in multiple places. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. As I mentioned, the purpose of this webinar is to give a little bit of a background about these grants and talk about the application process and timeline, and then a little bit about the services that we offer here at CLRC to have the work done in-house by our project assistants. And hopefully I'll get through this efficiently enough that we'll have time at the end for any questions that you all might have. Access and Digitization grants, we renamed these grants last year to give them a little more descriptive title. Previously, they were known as RBDB grants. RBDB stands for Regional Bibliographic Databases. As you can imagine, nobody knew what that stood for, and worse off, it doesn't really mean too much, currently. These are all state grants that are given to the library councils, and they've been in place for a long time. So over the decades of them being in place, the purpose and application have changed. So we finally got around to renaming these grants so that they're hopefully a little bit easier to remember what they actually are. This money is administered by the state's Department of Library Development. So CLRC receives these funds on an annual basis, and they are intended to give us the ability to support our members on a variety of technical services, webinars, workshops, a very wide variety of things. We also set aside $40,000 for these Access and Digitization grants. So while we also have a number of services that we're providing on behalf of all of our membership, we also have this money set aside so we can give you direct ability to do a lot of the work that this money is intended to do. So we've had a great response over the years to this grant program, and judging by the number of people on this webinar, I hope we'll have a great applicant pool this year as well. And one other final note about these funds, we have a committee here at CLRC known as the Library Resources and Services Committee. That committee is responsible for overseeing the expenditure of these funds, and also this is the committee that decides who gets these grants. So this is kind of a cool or a good arrangement because I'm able to work with all of you and advocate on your behalf to this committee. I am not the one who actually makes the decisions. So it puts me in a better position to be able to help all of you guys get the money for the projects you're hoping to work on. And one thing I should say before I go any further, if you have any questions, please feel free to send them in the question and answer or the chat. I have both open, so feel free to interrupt me. I'll try to catch it before I get too much further on in the content, but feel free to interrupt. So we've divided our Access and Digitization grants into 4 categories. This is mostly to have the application process match the activity. So the first category is digitization. This is essentially the converting or reformatting of analog, so physical materials, into digital formats. So essentially just digitizing materials. So this could be scanning, doing a transfer of like an audio visual recording to digital. And the purpose here is to make these materials available to share widely. So to that end, digitization projects typically include metadata process as well. So metadata is data about data. So that's where you're describing the objects that you've digitized. So putting up a photograph without any metadata makes it difficult to find. And when you do find it, you don't have the context you need to understand what you're looking at. So any digitization projects really need that metadata component as well as the actual digital objects you're creating. Secondly, on a very similar vein, metadata projects are available to create descriptive, structural, or administrative metadata. So essentially, these projects, this category of projects is if you have previously scanned or digitized materials that may be in another repository, they might be on a hard drive, they might have been born digital, and really you just need funds to support the work of describing them so that they can be shared. The next category is retrospective conversion. So this is an old holdover of where these funds were initially used and spent. Retrospective conversion is the process of taking a physical card catalog and making it digital, putting it together in a OPAC or integrated library system. So we hopefully don't have many of these projects left. There's a long tail of a few collections out there that might still be looking for this type of support. I'm going to get into this a little bit further in a couple slides. But this is basically upgrading your physical card catalog to a digital online equivalent. And it doesn't support, this isn't cataloging of new content. It's stuff that you already have cataloged and they're just transferring to digital. Finally, we have this special category that we added a couple of years ago that's kind of a subset of digitization, but it's specifically for newspaper digitization. Many of the newspapers are a pretty well-defined subset, and they tend to have, there's fewer questions in this version of the application. So it just kind of simplifies the application for newspapers. And this is, I should say, the digitization of physical or microfilm or like physical paper copies of newspapers. All right, so to dive into each one of these a little bit further, digitization, as I mentioned, is the conversion of a physical paper copy, if you will, to a digital copy of your materials. There's really no limits, no practical limits on what kind of formats we're talking. This could be anything from a cassette tape to a photograph to a yearbook. We tend to get a lot of yearbooks and projects like that, but we are open to working with folks to digitize a very wide variety of materials. Yeah, and I mentioned about metadata. We have, you need to have the metadata in place so that materials can be found and understood. An important part of this, important requirement of this type of application is that the materials must be made accessible to the public. So a lot of times these materials end up in New York Heritage Digital Collections, which is the repository that we work with our partners from across the state to run and manage. So New York Heritage is a free public access point that allows you to make your materials available to anybody with an internet connection. So we understand that some folks don't choose not to participate in New York Heritage. And this is usually because you're at a institution such as like a college or university that might have their own digital asset management software. So this would be a pretty limited case set of people who have their own repositories. This is something that would be on like Islandora or Content DM or any of those type of repository softwares. If that isn't direction you want to take with your materials, then it would be nice to have you talk to me so we make sure that it fits and that it qualifies. So just putting the digitized photographs up on your library's website in HTML wouldn't qualify. You would want to have it somewhere more structured than that. Moving on to metadata, taking a slightly deeper dive into this. A lot of the stuff I mentioned about digitization projects apply here. So a lot of times these metadata projects are really pulling in materials that might exist elsewhere, be used in a different repository that you want to share to a wider audience. And to that end, these materials also must be made publicly accessible. And if you, and this applies to digitization projects as well, if you do choose to go the route of having them in your own DAMS repository, you would need to make sure that you're following nationally recognized metadata standards. So making sure it's in Dublin Core or following best practices essentially, and not just, again, having it be a list of images on your website without any structure. All right, I'm not seeing any questions so far, so I'm hopefully not losing all you guys. So retrospective conversion, again, these are the projects that I hope to not see too many of, because it means that we've successfully gone through and done this work throughout the state, and hopefully it's not as much of an issue anymore. But if you do happen to have a collection of materials that is still in a physical card catalog, you need to meet these following requirements. And these are pretty well stipulated by the New York State RBDB standards. So this is not just coming from us, but it's also coming from the New York State. So the materials must be available, just like in the case of the metadata and digitization projects. And there's a formula that's used for this work. So you basically count the number of catalog records that you would be hoping to process. And then I'll get into this in a little bit when I go through the application questions, but you'll have $1 allocated for copy cataloging. So if this is something you're just pulling from OCLC or pulling an existing catalog record into your system, that's $1 per record. If you have unique records, so this is more doing original cataloging, or there's not a digital equivalent record out there, then you would count $10 per record for those materials. And then there's a limited amount of software support and supplies that you could also apply for in this category. Finally, newspaper digitization. This is a simpler version of the digitization and metadata application. Same rules apply. You need to make it publicly available. In this case, we really want everything coming through New York State Historic Newspapers, which is a repository that's run out of our partner organization, the Northern New York Library Network, which is one of the 9 library councils. And these materials should be made available there, even if it's in addition to other spots. So if you have them on your own website, or some vendors have a repository that they offer as part of their package, we would ask that you also put them in New York State Historic Newspapers. Looks like I have a question from Joe. We have a library which has a notebook listing by category by the items. We would like to put them in a public library system. Okay, so I think, Joe, I would have to get a little more context for what you're. Okay, so it's a Seplo card catalog. Yeah, and I will admit that I'm not an expert, and so I would have to touch base on the parameters of your project would be and whether they would qualify. I suspect it would, as long as you have some kind of cataloging in place and you're not starting entirely from scratch. That's my understanding. But that being said, I'm no expert in retrospective conversion, so I'll have to get back to you on specifics. Okay. All right. Yeah, and I think I covered everything on this slide. All right, so there's a number of expenses that are not supported in this accounts for all of the four categories that I went over. So, and this is also stipulated by the state mostly, and then practical considerations as well. So this is not a grant where you can take 10% for overhead costs as like, you know, we're not paying your heating bill for your building. It's pretty narrowly focused on the work, the equipment that you need to do the work. We don't fund current acquisitions, so we aren't giving out grants to go purchase a collection of photographs. There's an expectation that you already have these materials in your collections and you're just digitizing what you have, or you're working with your community partners or something like that. We also won't do direct payments for integrated library system costs or ILL costs. So we aren't giving you, there's other programs in place to offset interlibrary loans and all that kind of work. I just kind of conflated those two bullet points. Yeah, ILS and ILL, we don't really fund either of those to this program. There's other things in place. And this one's a little bit tricky. Hours that an employee would already be working. So what that means is, what that really gets down to is we're trying to increase your capacity to do this work. And so we're not in the business of subsidizing current salaries. So if you're hoping to have one of your staff members do this work and they're already full-time, then that wouldn't qualify because you already have them in your budget for doing that time. But on the other hand, if you have a current employee that's part-time, or if you're able to hire a part-time employee to do this work, then that is increasing your capacity and more in line with what this grant is intended for. Finally, on this slide, we because of the focus of these grants on being able to make the materials publicly viewable and shared, we cannot fund projects that you don't have sufficient permission to make available. So this really applies to metadata and digitization projects. So anything that you're getting money to digitize or describe, you should be able to then have the permission to share it on New York Heritage or New York State Historic newspapers or your own repositories. Okay, so I'm going to go through a few. We went through the kind of what you shouldn't do, and this slide's about what you should try to do. First of all, there's some examples of projects on the grant website, on the CLRC website. And this can give you a sense both of like the amounts of money that we've given out for various projects in the past, and also the types of projects we funded. So this hopefully gives you a better sense of what kind of scope we're talking about and what we're going after. The next point is really important. Project plan should be well thought out. This is where I come in. Like I'm available to all of you to help be a sounding board or help consult on your project plans. But the stronger your plan for completing the work, the better your chances are of getting the grant. It really shows when applicants have done their research and spent the time to figure out the logistics of the project versus just saying, hey, I have this box of materials that I want to digitize, and I don't have a real defined way of doing it. So the more detail you can give on that side of things, the better your application will come across to the committees that are reviewing it. Large projects can be split across multiple years. So this has been commonly done. If you can apply for a grant this year to start a project or to do a good piece of it, and then the next year you could say, okay, we're going to continue the work that we started last year, and there's generally we've been really good about funding continuation grants. I mean, if you're applying for a grant because you weren't able to finish a project, and that might be viewed a little bit differently. But if you're just kind of doing the next piece of the project, then that's great. You're building on previous work, which is great as well. This gets back to a couple points ago, detailed, reasonable budgets. So the better your project plan, the better you're able to say what you need the money for and where it's going. So this is also where I'm happy to help. So if you are curious whether your budget makes sense or whether you're being practical about what it's going to cost to a project, just feel free to shoot me an email. I'm happy to talk it over and help you get to that point. And the next couple points are important for previous awardees. So it's great to see that projects have been completed successfully and on time. So if you've done good work previously, then it's especially it makes it easier to give you more money because we've seen that you've done good work with what we've given you in the past. And also staying on top of the reporting, the grant reporting schedule, which I'll go over a little bit more later. It's pretty, our reporting is pretty minimal. So hopefully that makes it easier to actually get through and give us updates when we ask for them. And this final point has been really important over the last couple of years, really having a clear articulation of your copyright clearance to make the materials that you want to digitize or describe widely available. So I'll get into this more in a little bit, but the better you're able to make the case for your copyright, the fewer times I have to come back and say, hey, I need more documentation, or the committee is concerned about, your standing on copyright, because that's 9 times out of 10 the question that the committee have is relating to copyright. So the better you can give that to us up front, the better we can move forward and just give you money, which is what this is all about, right? All right, so one thing that we've been doing for the last couple of years, but it's really been ramping up, is having projects done in-house by CLRC project assistants in our Dig Lab. So actually at this moment, I have 2 project assistants sitting in the other room digitizing materials from the previous year's grant projects. We can do a pretty wide variety of materials. We have 2 book scanners now, one that's flat and the other that has a cradle. We also have flatbed scanners. So the benefit of doing the work through us versus going out and getting a vendor quote, which I still recommend that you look into, is that we're not trying to make money off the process. We're just trying to provide this as a service to our members. So our quotes for projects tend to come in quite a bit below what a commercial vendor would charge. That being said, we can only handle so much, and we can only handle certain kinds of materials. If it's particularly fragile or audiovisual materials, we would probably not be able to handle that. I feel better sending it out to a professional vendor. We're not digitizing the Gutenberg Bible or anything here, but I feel like we're doing good work for the projects that we've been working on, and it's been working really well. We in order to get a quote for this work, I really want folks to reach out before the grant application is due. So I gave a deadline of the 22nd of January. So before that point, reach out with and shoot me an email with the number of pages or items or photographs or whatever that you're hoping to do. The format, so this is important. Are they bound? If they're bound, how close are they to the margin? Are they spiral bound? Are they bound, like a library binding, like a professional binding? And then the size is also really important. So a good portion of the projects we've been doing have been yearbooks. We're pretty good at yearbooks. We can do, the normal 8.5 by 11 pretty well on our new book scanner. But larger materials are not off the table. It might need, there's more of a conversation that needs to happen after you get beyond 8.5 by 11-ish for a year, like a normal size yearbook. We've been doing a lot of newspapers and other materials that on our flat book scanner, and that one can go up, I think I want to say like 11.5 to 17 or 18 inches. So that has a pretty large scanning surface. And then the other benefit of going through us is we handle the full process. So the general workflow is we get your materials from you, we do the digitization, we do the metadata, we ask for some input from, especially on metadata and the contextual information that we need for your collection, and then we do the upload on your behalf. So you write the grant, and then we do pretty much all the work for the grant. So that's one of the reasons why it's been a popular option. I think 9 out of the 17 projects that we had come through last year, we're doing in-house. And it makes it a lot easier for all of you because you are all busy and have a lot of other responsibilities. So we're able to kind of take it off your hands. So yeah, it's really important that you reach out if you're interested in having us do the work. There's also some incentive to reach out earlier than later. For the current year's project, I've been pretty much going in order of who submitted request first, and that's how I'm deciding whose materials we digitize first. So if you wanted to get done sooner, get me a quote or ask me for a quote sooner. Okay, so please ask if you have any questions about this. All right, I'm going to go through briefly a couple of examples of previous projects just to give you kind of a sense of what the considerations are for these projects as you're putting together the applications. So my example of digitization project was actually from not this year, but the previous year. Jervis Public Library has a collection of drawings from their namesake, John B. Jervis, who was a civil engineer in the early 1800s and designed a lot of important aqueducts, and actually has some role in some of the first steam engines in the United States. So it's a wonderful collection. What they ended up doing, and this is kind of an example of how we can be flexible about these kind of things. They had an outside vendor digitize the materials, which were large and fragile, and so they had Syracuse Blueprint digitize, and then the metadata component, they gave us a bunch of materials, and we did the metadata on their behalf, and then they kind of did a final look at the metadata, and we put it up. So it's a really great collection. It turned out really nice. But it shows how we can also split the work between either outside vendor, your own library staff, and us. Like there's kind of hybrid models available as well. A metadata project also from 2 years ago. Sculpture Space is a artist residency program that's based out of Utica, and they had a separate grant-funded project to document the public art in Oneida County, and they produced a book, and there's a website for Art Oneida, but they were concerned that the material was kind of off on its own island, and also they wanted to ensure its long-term use and preservation. So they had an outside contractor do the metadata conversion for them. And we're still in the process of getting everything up into New York Heritage. But it's an example of kind of taking existing material and moving it into New York Heritage or moving it into a different repository. And it's been also worked out really well, although it's been a slower process than I think we had hoped. Retrospective conversion, we've had very few of these come through recently. I believe all the public libraries are all set on this front. So the last one we had was from Holy Trinity Seminary, which is a Orthodox, Russian Orthodox seminary in Jordanville, New York. And we thought we were done with their retrospective conversion, but then they found another collection of materials that had yet to be converted. So they applied for this grant 2 or 3 years ago, I can't remember. And they're hopefully wrapping that up, and that will be the last of their retrospective conversion. Newspaper digitization. This is an example of a project that we actually just finished recently, and it's about to go up to New York Heritage. So OCC sent us their student newspapers, physical copies, and we digitized them on our flatbed book scanner. And they are heading for New York State Historic Newspapers. We've done the metadata, and we've done all the file processing to get it ready. Now it's just a matter of doing the final steps. And I'm hoping before the holidays that we'll have sent them on, and they'll be in the queue at New York State Historic Newspapers and up sometime next year, probably. So yeah, those are four examples, but there's many more if you have any questions or want further examples. So next, I want to go over the timeline for this. As I mentioned before, there is a deadline of January 22nd, which I believe is a Wednesday, the Wednesday before the grant deadline, to ask for a quote. This gives me enough time to get back to you and to make sure that I'm taking some time to give you an accurate quote. Also, this is also the deadline if you have any further private consultation. I'd like to have it done before then, so you're not waiting until the last minute. Of course, I'm available up until the end if you have questions, but I prefer not to answer. Be working with 15 different project proposals all in the last 24 hours. So try to get stuff in and ask me questions as early as possible. All right, and then of course the January 31st is the application deadline. That's a Friday. It's the last day of the month. It should, hopefully that'll give you guys all enough time to work on this. I've tried to streamline the application as much as possible, as you'll see in the next few slides. So hopefully it won't be too much of a burden to apply by that date. Once we have the applications, there are a couple of committees that review them. As I mentioned towards the beginning of this webinar, the Library Resources and Services Committee is made up of our representatives from our membership, and that committee will do the first pass and make their recommendations as to whether a project should be funded in whole or in part or not at all. And their comments and recommendations will be reviewed by an external committee, which is typically made up of my colleagues from around the state. So other folks who are working with New York Heritage and New York State Historic Newspapers. And so they give another set of comments on it. And then I see there's a question, but I'll come back to it. And then my goal is to have this, all the recommendations and all the comments in place for the March meeting of the CLRC board, which then the board typically approves the recommendations of the other committees. And then in hopefully early April, we'll be able to say, be able to reach out to all of you and announce whether you've what we were able to give you for your projects. So that means the earliest you would be able to start a project if you receive funding for it is most likely sometime in early to mid-April. So the other thing that I try to do is keep that time between your application and when you can get started short, because I know it can be, you put all this time into planning and then you have to take a pause, which can be, excruciating for anybody. And then the reporting schedule is pretty drawn out. So the following January, we ask that you submit an interim report. So this is just a check-in saying, hey, where are you? Are you anticipating any problems to finish on time? And then by the end of June, so June 30th, 2021, so you have a little over a year to work on the project. We ask that the final reports are due and that all money is spent and you're kind of wrapped them all up. And this final report is really just a summary of what was accomplished and, whether there's any deviations or unexpected occurrences that happened in the process of working for the project. We do not, these aren't reimbursement grants, so we don't ask for receipts. We don't ask for the money that you didn't spend back unless there was some kind of circumstances that prevented you from doing the project at all. But really, it's a pretty relatively easy reporting process as grants go. So I try to make it as easy on you guys as possible. Okay, so I did have a question from Rebecca Hewitt from SUNY Poly. Can the in-house digitization lab digitize microfilm? So that's a really good question, actually. We are not equipped to digitize microfilm here at CLRC, but the Northern New York Library Network that runs the New York State Historic Newspapers website, they have a full setup for digitizing from microfilm. So typically, if you have newspapers on microfilm, you're of course welcome to look into other vendors, and there's a vendor list listed on our the grant website. But really, it's often cheaper and more efficient to send your microfilm up to Northern. Their estimates are usually about 15 cents a page, or like an image on microfilm. So you would, much like other estimates, you would have to get a sense of quantity, and you would email them at digitization at nnyln.org, and they would give you a quote for that. They're very, very efficient at it. They're up to 10 million pages in their repository, and I'd say a good portion of that was done in-house by them. So they have a fair amount of experience. A couple other questions. Oh, okay, does digitization include converting handwriting to text? So handwriting to text would require human input. So any kind of transcribing like that you could work into your budget. We haven't done any of that in-house, but I don't, unless it's like really hard to read, I don't know as that would be an issue for us to do. I think we could probably manage it. And then of course, if you're doing it at your own, with your own library staff or with any of like an external vendor, that would just be, increase the amount of time that you're spending on the project. But kind of on more as an aside, I think the value of that being spent would really depend on the materials. Of course, if you have a text transcript, you have keywords and the whole thing is searchable, versus an image of a handwritten page. Those words won't show up in search results. Anything that's typed or is machine readable, we would run through optical character recognition software whether or not we do the digitization, we could still do that that part of it for you. But handwriting is a different beast. And I don't know as I don't have good estimations for how much time that takes. But I'm sure there's tools around the internet. You can do some research and get some benchmarks for estimating that time. Okay. I'm gonna run through the application really quickly. One thing to note, there are worksheets available on the grant website. So each one of the 4 categories has a separate application, but you start in one place, but then it's like a choose your own adventure. So, if you choose metadata, then you get the questions for the metadata application. If you choose newspapers, you get just those questions. So there are worksheets available online at this URL here, and there's both PDF and Word doc application worksheets. The benefit of this is also that because the application itself is done in a Google form, you can't work on it piecemeal and save your work. You pretty much have to sit down and fill it all out at once. And depending on how complicated your application is, that might not be practical. Plus, if you're anything like me, I would be freaked out by the fact that, if I accidentally close a window, I'd lose all my work. So I recommend using those worksheets, or at least like composing some of your longer answers elsewhere, so you don't have to have that stress of, the form closing on you. But the form also makes it a lot easier for us because we're able to quickly give a copy back to you and also track all the information that you have in the form. So without further ado, there are 13 questions in the beginning that all categories answer. These are the kind of the basic contact and information about the project. So, what institution? Are you part of a library system? Very important, who's the contact for this project? Oftentimes the contact for the project should be the person who's actually going to be overseeing the work that's done. Sometimes that's the library director or your institution's director, but oftentimes it's somebody a little bit closer to the ground. It really depends on how your organization is structured and how you approach the projects. Okay, so this also brings up, you are able to apply for multiple projects. So if you have, I would probably recommend them being smaller projects, not ask for 2 projects to the max, which the maximum award for these projects is $10,000, but we tend to give out closer to the $1,000 to $5,000 range for most projects. But technically we can accept projects up to 10,000, although I think we would be relatively unlikely to do that quantity, especially if we have a large applicant pool. But yeah, so if you have a couple of smaller projects, so say you have, or if you want to get your feet wet in a couple of things, so you could do a small set of yearbooks and then a photograph collection, and you would just want to say which is more important. So if we have a particularly competitive applicant pool, we're able to give you money where you most want it. And yeah, the rest of it's pretty straightforward. The title of the project is how we will refer to it internally as we're doing the review process. So it's nice when that's descriptive. Clever, I guess, can be nice, but sometimes it's not as useful as descriptive. But yeah, having a title is important. And I see I have another question in the Q&A section, so let me take a pause and answer that real quick. Oh, and actually I answered it. That's perfect. So yeah, the maximum is $10,000, but realistically we're looking in the $1,000 to $5,000 range or so. And really it's most important that your ask be in line with the project that you're trying to do and its importance. And if you're don't just ask for $10,000 because that's the max, and don't just come up with an arbitrary number because it sounds good. It's really helpful to see that the budget match the scope of work you're going to be working on. But yeah, should have a slide about the amounts here, but I don't. So thank you for bringing that up. All right, so this next section is if you choose digitization or metadata projects, you would get this set of questions. We really want you to be able to describe to us why you want to embark on this digitization project. So, the impact to your community, and making sure that you understand, the use case for it. So, who's going to be using it and how, and how is this the best way to share these materials with your patrons, with your users, etc. Evaluation is also important. How will you know if you've been successful in completing this project? And it's also nice to see projects that have some kind of plan for continuation. So we don't just give you $1,000 to digitize some photographs and then you disappear for after the money dries up. So it's nice to see that projects are building the groundwork for further work as well. Again, I mentioned this before, one of the most important parts of this application is demonstrating that you have copyright permission. And one thing I've added to the application is a place where you can upload documentation of your copyright clearance. So this might be a letter from the copyright holder, or letter from the copyright holder, or some kind of written correspondence. It is also possible to make a fair use argument, and in which case we could talk through what that documentation would look like. But really, we want to see that you've thought of and asked the right people for permission, because this is 9 times out of 10 the question that the review committees have about a project. Do they actually have permission that they're claiming? And with this documentation, you can permit and kind of take that question off the table. And then finally, where will the materials be made available? This is important. So New York State Historic Newspapers, or New York Heritage, or your own repository. Okay, I'm going to try to keep speeding through here because I'm realizing that time is slipping away here. There's a section on budget for digitization and metadata projects. So this is where you can ask for, specific things. We're less likely to give money for hardware, software, telecommunications, or like supplies, materials, where we really like to see that, again, building capacity and devoting resources to personnel and actually doing the work. That being said, there are occasions where asking for hardware would be appropriate. Really the concern is you'd want to make the case, why should we buy you a scanner when you could probably just borrow our scanner? And if we do buy you a scanner, how will the long-term use be of it versus sharing that scanner in the region instead of giving it to one person. So if you're asking for hardware, you just want to be prepared to make that argument. Retrospective conversion. This is pretty straightforward. It is really important to know how many items you hope to convert and the percentage of which are copy catalog versus original or the catalog records that are going to take more time. So that is a good portion of this, and a lot of times we have there's outside vendors doing this or library staff. So just making sure you're accounting for where that money is coming from or where that money is going. Newspaper digitization. Again, this is a simplified version of the digitization and metadata projects. So we really want to see all the newspaper titles and date ranges, like what's the content that you want to digitize. And again, copyright status is really important for newspapers. They're published, so anything before 1924 is going to be in public domain. After that, it gets a lot more complicated. Again, if you want help navigating that process, I'm always happy to help. Consult on copyright status. We assume that you're probably going to have a vendor handle your digitization, or either of microfilm or the newspaper pages, which are often larger than most people can handle on their own scanners. So more details about that is helpful. All right, and then finally, at the end, there are 3 questions that everybody answers. Will you accept partial funding? And if so, how will that affect your project? The larger our applicant pool, the more likely we'll be looking at partial funding. But really, this is helpful for us because we very rarely have not given an applicant any money, but it's pretty frequent also that we give them a partial grant, either to bring the scope more in a realistic level, or because we have funding restrictions. So that's really important. And then, if you have anything else to add, there's a kind of a catch-all miscellaneous question at the very end that if you wanted to tell us something and it wasn't encapsulated by any of the other questions, you can ask it there. Okay, so I don't have quite as much time for questions as I'd hoped, but hopefully, I'm also happy to stay on as long as people are still asking questions. So feel free to type questions in chat or Q&A. I might be able to put people's mics on if I can. Oh yeah, I can. So if you have a really complicated question, I can allow you to, there's a button for me to allow you to talk. So, let me know in the comments. Trying to think if there's anything I missed. Is the PowerPoint online? Yes, I will make the PowerPoint available alongside the recording of this on that grant's website. So actually, while we're doing this, let's just take a quick look at that website. So this can be found by going to under services and grants and awards on our website. There are this top areas where you have a lot of the crucial information. So you'll see all the preparation worksheets in this column. This informational webinar, the content for this will change to a recording and a link to the PowerPoint. And then the actual application is here. Of course, it's asking me to sign in. Strange. Maybe I'll have to check that and make sure I don't have something set up wrong. But in theory, you should be able to go here for the. Oh, come on. Yeah. Anyway, it's not going to cooperate with me right now because I'm doing it live on a webinar. But in theory, you should be able to get to the application there, which is in Google Forms. You page through the different levels of the application, roughly in line with the slides I just showed, and then hit submit at the end, and you get a copy of the application, and as do I, and go from there. Any other questions? If you can't articulate your question now, or if you just want to ask me a more in-depth question or something like that, feel free to email me. Really, it's way easier. I'd rather talk to all of you about your project individually in advance if I can, because then I know what you're talking about and I can help advocate on your behalf to the review committees, and that has often made the difference in maybe I'll explain some of the details of your applications and increase the amount of your chances of getting money. So please don't be afraid to reach out. Okay, well, I'm not seeing any questions. So, thank you all for coming. I hope this was informative. If it wasn't, then let me know what else I can tell you about, and I'll do that. Well, I don't know about where all you guys are, but it's getting kind of snowy out, so be safe. And I will hopefully be in touch with many of you about your applications. Have a great holidays. Okay. All right. Bye, everyone.